sizes. Think about thunderheads, for example. Okay, they happen on a few mile scale, so you have to make up some assumption about what's going on inside each of these boxes, and different people make different assumptions. A third is that the boxes are not really cubes, but they're pancakes, because the atmosphere is really thin compared to the size of the Earth, and the ocean is also pretty thin. And so you have to make up assumptions about how things move vertically that are not directly tied to the fundamental physical laws. So all of those, make a lot of trouble. And that's why the world has 50 different such models. And to get predictions, they average all of them together.
Okay, so let's take that apart just so everyone understands. So the first is these models are not very high resolution, either spatially or temporally. So you have to use huge cubes, plus you're only sampling...
Temporally is pretty good, 10 minutes. Spatially,
right, but
it's terrible.
But we also, perhaps on the temporal side, the thing is we're looking at relatively small deviations in temperature, right? If it's 1 degree over a century, this is not a huge effect. And what that means is that the models aren't high resolution enough to be accurate to that scale. They're simply not.
That's true. That's true.
Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't model, because our models get better and better all the time. But there's a big difference between modeling something, even if you can make it accurate to predict the past, and being able to model the present. But there's a walloping difference between being able to model the present and being able to model climate 100 years from now, because the errors compound as you predict out into the future.
Yes, that's certainly true, although you hope to be describing averages that are reasonably well predicted. There's several comments about that. One is, human influences are small. They're, as you say, a 1% effect. We're concerned about a rise of 2 degrees, whereas the Earth's surface temperature is about 300 degrees, so it's like a 1% effect. The second is, we're interested not in describing the climate, but in describing how the climate responds to those influences. That's the big question. And that's an order of magnitude harder job than describing the climate itself. The third thing is, we're looking over time scales of 100, 150 years, and we have terrible data to describe what happened in the past. Yes, we have reasonable confidence about the average global temperature, but what goes on in the oceans, which is really where climate happens, the oceans are the long-term component of the system, we have terrible data until about 20 years ago, when we started putting out floats of various kinds.
Well, and how good is the ocean data? The ocean's pretty damn deep, and it's not like we can measure everything that's happening in the ocean. I can't imagine we understand long-term current flows from the depths well enough to be predicting climate alteration on the scale of a few degrees. That just strikes me as unbelievably preposterous.
Right. Studies that have attempted to reproduce the warming of the ocean show that the ocean was warming at about half the current rate, even as the Little Ice Age started to end. And so untangling this long-term natural variability from the effect of human influence, which has only really been significant for the last 70 or 80 years or so, is a very, very difficult problem, maybe the central problem in climate.
Okay. Now, you talked about when you were at BP, you got somewhat excited about the possibility of biofuel. We didn't really continue down that road. What are your thoughts on the nuclear front, let's say, and did you see developments there that you regarded as a lot of people talk about modular nuclear power, for example,
right. So full disclosure first, I began life as a nuclear physicist.
Right.
And so the atom is my friend. I'm a scientist, not an engineer. I don't think I could build a credible nuclear reactor, but I certainly understand how they work in great detail and understand the economics and the business and so on. I think if the world is serious about reducing carbon dioxide emissions, nuclear power has to be a big part of the future. Essentially zero emissions, reasonably economic and a demonstrated technology, right? Roughly 20% of U.S. electricity comes from fission. 80% of French electricity comes from fission. Maybe it's 75 now. So, we know how to do this. The problem is that the big ones, particularly in the U.S., the existing power plants, of which there are about 90-something now in the U.S., are very expensive. You have to put down a lot of money at the beginning, $10, $20 billion, and then you don't start to pay it off until 30 years hence when you sell the electricity that you've been making. And so you need a stable and sensible regulatory environment for these big capital expenses.
Well, look, we were building nuclear power plants, 60 years ago. And so we should be better at it now, especially at the modular level. So one of the things I'm curious about, well, two, I suppose, is to what degree does insane regulation make nuclear power unbelievably expensive? And then the second question would be, given that insane regulation does make nuclear power extremely expensive, do you think there's any possibility at all, practically speaking, that red tape could be reversed? Germany just built an LNG port in like 5 months. So, it's obvious we can get our act together when we need
We can do this.
Yeah.
I think, regulation has been a big part of why big nuclear is expensive. I'm all for making sure these things are safe. We have to do that. That's the primary consideration, and the industry believes that as well. The problem is that in the U.S., we have built every reactor custom built. They're all different, right? Even if the names are more or less the same, in detail they're different. The hope is with small modular reactors is to focus the regulation so that you can get one design approved and then you can make 100 of them.
Right.
And ship them around the country. You build them in a factory and you put them on a flatbed rail car and bring them to the site. It would also ease the economics because you pay for the first one and then you use the cash flow from it to finance the second one and the third one and so on at a site.
Yeah, well, I'd read that Rolls-Royce is doing that. They've got a proposal.
So Rolls-Royce is doing that, right? So in the U.S., there are two companies, I remember the name of one of them, called NuScale, and I think they hope to have the first one in the ground within the next 5 or 6 years. You got to come down the learning curve. Right now, the costs are more expensive than big nuclear per kilowatt hour produced. But as they come down the learning curve and build more of these and so on, the costs should come down.